Welcome back to Monday Musings, a casual conversation about culture and theology. I'm Justin Neely.
And I'm Daniel Chen. We're just a couple guys talking about some stuff.
The stuff we're talking about in this series is called Counter-Catechesis. We're talking about how to take some of the narratives that come our way from our culture and flip them and use the gospel to both affirm and then subvert and then see how the gospel fulfills the deep desires from within them.
Yeah, it's just interesting thing that people are looking for answers,
right?
For meaning, for to fulfill their longings. And we know as Christians only the gospel, only what the truths we find in the scriptures, only through the gospel that we ultimately find in God can fill those needs. But the culture constantly is changing and morphing into different ways how to answer these big life questions.
Yeah.
And so we're teaching you, okay, how do you read the culture, and then also how do you speak the gospel into it? This is what you're actually looking for.
For sure. So we're excited to continue this series today by talking about the identity narrative. And this might be one of the most fundamental ones, if not the most fundamental one, of kind of our modern culture. But before we get there, we have to have the restaurant of the month. What's yours?
So my restaurant of the month is a ramen restaurant called the Ramen Spot. So if you live in the Johns Creek Alpharetta area, this is off of North Point Parkway. But I love ramen, and this restaurant, it's owned by these Chinese people who lived in Japan. And his original restaurant, this guy who opened Ramen Spot, he opened in Japan. And so,
nice.
You know, you have places like, have you eaten a lot of ramen?
No.
Yeah, the most famous place around here is a place called Jinya.
Okay.
And Jinya is like, I think it's not good. And it's like not good hipster white people ramen.
Got it.
Is that true? I don't know. That's just my impression. So if you're like a Jinya fan and you're offended, I don't take that back. But the Ramen Spot, this is really simple, straightforward, very just simple flavors, but very well executed.
Nice.
And so I've been there 2 or 3 times. The owners are great. The food is just so good. And so get the katsu ramen. That's what I would suggest.
Okay.
And then they have these beef buns, and they're amazing. So
nice.
They are so good. So anyways, go to the Ramen Spot. And if you don't live around here, find a good ramen restaurant. It's hard to find a good ramen restaurant. So
I wouldn't know. Never looked. My restaurant of the month it's called Loyal Q Barbecue. It's off of Old Milton Parkway, and if you've been off Old Milton, it's like the giant, like it looks like a big log cabin. Really good, reasonably priced, good barbecue. So
yeah, this might be too specific, but what kind of barbecue? Is it like Texas, Memphis?
Gosh.
Kansas City, North Carolina?
I'm showing my ignorance here. I have no idea.
I didn't know. Okay.
No idea.
It's just good.
Good.
That's all you know.
Good barbecue.
Yeah.
Yeah. We had brisket and pulled pork, mac and cheese, and collard greens.
Okay.
Very happy.
You're a mac and cheese guy.
I'm a mac and cheese guy.
Yeah. So if you say that they have good mac and cheese,
they
then
do.
I believe you.
Yeah. So that's mine. Loyal Q. So the ramen spot, and Loyal Q barbecue. All right, so we're talking about counter-catechesis and how to kind of flip the cultural narratives. And last week, 2 weeks ago, we introduced it. Last week, we talked about the freedom narrative. This week, we want to talk about the identity narrative. And this might be the most fundamental of all of them in our late modern mind. We're getting this from Tim Keller's book on preaching. But the identity narrative is basically this idea that you have to discover your deepest desires and longings and then fulfill them.
Yep.
Like that's the most important thing you can do in life. Robert Bella calls this expressive individualism. Tim Keller calls this the sovereign self. But I mean, both of those terms get to the idea of, you discover your dreams and chase after them.
Yeah. It's becoming your truest self, right? That's the most important thing you can do. Something I thought about with this, the podcast we're doing, the series we're doing, is those of our listeners who are the older, wiser listeners from a different generation,
that was nicely put.
I would be curious if you see this in your peers. You know?
Probably not as much.
Yeah. Isn't that interesting?
You know, you worked at the company for 40 years and got the gold watch, and even if you hated every minute of it, didn't matter.
Yeah.
Like, it's just what you did. It wasn't about following your dreams. It was about doing your duty.
Doing your duty.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's just totally different. And I
Yep.
think thinking about doing this podcast, doing this series has really made me think a lot about just the importance of generational differences.
Sure.
And how a lot of the miscommunication is because of those differences that people don't think about.
Don't even know.
Yeah,
Yep.
because I'm sure it exists, this idea of truest self with different generations, but it's got to be. You got to think it's got to be less prevalent, right?
Right.
But this is the call of Gen Z.
Sure.
I mean, millennials too, for sure.
Yep.
But Gen Z definitely. I mean, this is.
Well, I mean, if you think about compared divorce rate as an example, right? And obviously, divorces happen throughout the centuries.
Right.
But when you look at the uptick in recent years, obviously you have what I would say the Bible, opens the door for divorce as a biblically permissible option under adultery, abandonment, and I'd add abuse as a subcategory of abandonment. But you hear a lot of times, often in the society we live in, well, I just wasn't happy. The rise of no-fault divorce laws in our country.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, this is expressive individualism. You have a previous generation that said the most important thing is duty, so you stick with the marriage regardless of whether you're happy or not. But this current identity narrative is the most important thing you can do is follow your dreams.
Yep.
And if your marriage is getting in the way of that, well, then get rid of your marriage because you got to follow your dreams.
Yeah.
I mean, we see the most radical, expression of this is the transgender movement.
Sure.
Right? I mean, it's I will literally make biological changes to myself if that makes me feel more fulfilled. Whatever it takes to follow my dream.
Right.
Know? So we see this everywhere, and this narrative is kind of maybe the foundational piece of our current culture.
For sure. And something to point out too is we just have, what's that term that you use, the chronological snobbery?
Yeah, yeah.
Where we always look back and just think we just arrived at the pinnacle.
Finally
of
got it. Yep.
But honestly, everything is sowing and reaping.
Yep.
And you think all the way back to like Descartes, I think, therefore I am.
Sure.
This ground was laid
Long time ago. Yeah.
And now we're just seeing the fruit of it.
I feel, therefore I am.
Yeah. You see the fruit fully forming.
Yep.
Now, much, much later.
Yep.
And all the way to, the transgenderism that can start to change my physical. Technology has progressed to such a level that you can change your physical self that was given to you in your biology, right, by God.
Yes.
Because of, it's funny, I doubt Descartes was thinking about that when he said that statement, but yet where do you get that idea? It's, it's like a drawn out version of that.
The modern person, and by modern I mean not postmodern,
Right.
Criticize Christianity for following what they would call feelings. We'd say faith. They'd say feelings over facts or science.
Right.
Right. And the criticism is you're not scientific enough. You need to be more absorbed in facts. You're obsessed with faith or whatever.
Right.
That would be the critique. Well, now the narrative has flipped, and it's deny biology for feelings. So you deny facts and science to chase whatever feeling you have.
Right.
So our feelings have become the most ultimate.
Yeah.
In our culture.
Yep.
And
we talked about this last podcast, but you have in the modern way of thinking, the highest, the thing you compare everything to is rational thought.
Sure.
And it's moved in the postmodern to understand the new generations. The postmodern generation is that feelings is essentially God.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's interesting. So Keller, in his kind of dismantling of this, he starts with the affirm. What can we affirm from this, which is what we've been going through. And he says that unlike thinkers of classical antiquity, Christians actually regarded emotions as something not to be ignored or suppressed, but examined and redirected toward God. So, yeah, you start with this kind of ancient, kind of stoic thought of just ignore it, just suppress it. And he's saying, no, like engaging your desires is a good thing. In many ways, it's a Christian thing.
Right.
So that's the affirm, but the subversion goes to, but what our culture has done is, Keller said, we've gone beyond merely understanding and directing our own passions to enthroning them.
Yeah.
Our passions, our desires have become our Lord.
Right.
And he actually cites, and we talked about this a little bit last week, he cites the Let It Go song from Frozen as a perfect example of this. You know, in the Let It Go song, she says, let it go, can't hold it back anymore. Let it go, turn away and slam the door. I don't care what they're going to say. Let the storm rage on. The cold never bothered me anyway. She says, the wind is howling, swirling like a storm inside. Couldn't keep it in. Heaven knows I tried. Don't let them in. Don't let them see. Be the good girl you always have to be. Conceal, don't feel. Don't let them know. Well, now they know. She says, let it go. So the whole point is I'm breaking through all of these societal expectations, and I'm going to decide now who I get to be. I'm finally free to decide who I'm going to be, which is the crux of the identity narrative.
Yeah. And the irony of that is that you get that from the societal narrative.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's like you're breaking away from the old societal narrative, but you're realigning yourself with the new societal narrative, which is to do that.
For sure. And Keller gets into that. He has two interesting thoughts. The first is that the problem with the identity narrative is it assumes we know what we want.
Yeah.
Which is not necessarily true. And then the second is it assumes we don't have desires that contradict.
Yeah.
Which is also not true. So the example he gives is an Anglo-Saxon warrior in Britain in AD 800. And he says he has two deep desires in his life. One desire is aggression. He enjoys smashing and killing people when they show him disrespect. And living in this shame.
And that's it. That's our podcast.
Yes, in the end. Thank you for listening. And living in a shame-honor culture with this warrior ethic, he identifies with this feeling, and he says, that's the true me. I'm a warrior. I'm aggressive. That's who I am. I'll express myself that way. The other desire this man has in this fictional account is same-sex attraction. He's attracted to other men. But he says, that's not me. I will control and suppress my impulse. Then Keller says, imagine a man walking around Manhattan today. He has the same two desires as that Anglo-Saxon warrior from AD 800. One is the desire for aggression. He wants to smash people that disrespect him. One is a same-sex desire. Well, he's going to say no to the first one. That's not really who I am. I'm going to suppress that. He's going to say yes to the second one. This is who I am fundamentally. And Keller asks, why? Well, it's not because you're actually free. It's because you've embraced the grid that your culture has placed on you.
Yeah.
You have accepted the narrative. And so, yeah, ironically, this narrative builds on the narrative.
Right.
And so he says we get our sense of self and our sense of identity from the stories of our culture and from what is perceived to be heroic.
Yep.
And what is applauded and encouraged. No one ever forms their identity in a vacuum just by yourself. And so in the Middle Ages, the warrior culture was applauded. In our current culture, right, same-sex attraction is applauded. So maybe you have the same two desires, but you use the grid of your culture, you suppress one and take the other as your most fundamental identity. And so, yeah, there's no way to form your identity outside of your culture. So you're actually not quite as self-expressive as you think. You're just falling in line with what the culture says you should fall in line with.
Yeah. Yeah, in your attempt to be individualistic, you're just conforming
Super
to
conformist. Yeah.
you're conforming to the current societal narrative.
Right. Yeah. So it's really interesting. He basically said in traditional societies, I'll just read the quote. In traditional societies, if you were simply a good son or daughter, husband or wife, father or mother, you were doing all your society required. That could be smothering and confining, but the bar for recognition was not impossibly high. The modern process of identity formation, however, tells you that you have to go out and create a self from scratch. You must identify your dreams, especially the most vivid ones, and fulfill them, or feel like a failure. That prospect crushes those in many segments of our society where money, looks, power, success, sophistication, and romantic love all become not just good things, but necessary identity factors. And this is where he's doing a good job subverting the narrative, showing, man, this is like an impossibly heavy burden to carry. You have to discover who you are. Like, there was problem with traditional cultures of you just have to fit into this box. This is who you are, accept it or reject it. So that's not great, but it's not necessarily crushing. You might be bored or unhappy, but our modern culture, to have to create your identity and recreate, and that's exhausting.
Yeah.
And that's where it just doesn't work.
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of the narratives talk about finding your true self, like it's buried deep within you that you have to uncover. That's already everything is inside of you already.
Yep, all you need is within you, and just kind of
and I think there's a couple of silly things to me about that. One, it's like, man, that's the most like Calvinistic thing I've ever heard, right? Like you can't break away from
wow.
Like,
talk about irresistible grace. Yeah.
That's like, oh, okay, your
no choice,
future is set.
Yeah.
Like in that way, I'm like, that's more, you're holding tighter to that than a lot of our Reformed theology does, which is kind of crazy. And I think the second thing too is I guess when you take away the transcendence of God, the only place else to look is inward.
Right.
But you're never going to find what you're trying to find because it doesn't exist. You don't exist apart from God.
Yeah.
And so it's this, like, I think, cycle of despair in a lot of ways, because even when you reach the level of the true self you're trying to reach, it's never enough, and you got to seek for more. But when does that end?
Right. Yeah, and so this is when he kind of moves to the gospel, and he talks about how Christianity offers something so liberating. He says the imago Dei, being created in the image of God, means that our value is both inherent, it comes from simply being human, and contingent. It reminds us how dependent we are upon God. It's an identity that is not achieved but received.
Yeah.
And
that's what I was talking about.
Yeah, that's just so important that, we basically are teaching that you have to achieve your identity. And Christianity says, no, you receive it first from just being created as a human being. That's a received identity. And then in the work of Christ and what Christ has done in the gospel, it's not perform and then you can become a son of God. It is receive the grace of God and you're made a son or daughter of God. And so it's a received identity being in Christ, not a achieved identity, which is so liberating from the burden of having to create your own identity.
I think about, what if I told my son, figure out what it means to be my son? You figure it out.
Oh my gosh!
And then
what a cruel thing to do.
And then I'll tell you if
you made it or not.
Yeah. No, that's not. I actually tell my son all the time, you are my son.
Yeah.
I'll love you.
Yeah.
That's who you are.
Yeah.
You're son of God. You're a son of me. You know,
Right.
You're my son, and he knows. He knows who he is.
Yep.
He does not have to discover it, and there's true freedom in that.
Absolutely.
And we get that from God as well.
Yeah.
Can imagine it, we think we're expressing freedom by trying to find our true identity, but instead we're just walking around lost aimlessly in like the forest of our own like ignorance.
Yeah.
And really what is actual freeing in this is when God says, this is who you are, and then I know
For sure.
that is who I am.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so good. Yeah, Keller says there's kind of three theological terms that help see our identity. One is justification, that through the work of Christ we've been declared legally righteous in God's court of law, and we didn't do that. Second is adoption. We've been brought into God's family. Like you said to your son, you're a chin, right?
Yeah.
We belong to Christ. We're a part of God's family through the work of Christ. And third is just this idea of union with Christ. We're in him. And then he goes on to say, God puts his family name on us. The question of identity is not who am I, but whose am I?
That's good.
Only if God names us and we serve him will we be free from enslavement, because he grants us love on the basis of Jesus' performance, not ours. If he names us, if we are his, we can finally rest in our identity as his child. And yeah, I think your illustration is so perfect because, like, man, what a horrible way to live if you told that to your kids and they felt, okay, like, I hope I can, I don't know what it means to be a chin, but I got to figure that out.
Yeah.
And then hopefully once I'm 18, I'll find out if I did that right, you know? That's like emotional abuse.
That's so mean.
It's awful.
Yeah.
But that's basically what we do in the identity narrative is like, I don't know what it means to be the happiest me, but I guess I have to figure that out and create me and define me and discover me, when the gospel says, no, that's an exhausting way to live. You are defined by being created in the image of God, and then as a Christian as being a part of the family of God. And it's a received, not achieved identity. So you can breathe. You can, takes the shackles off that we put on ourselves.
Yeah, I was even thinking, it's like if the who you are versus whose you are. If you know whose you are, then you know how to act.
Yeah.
But instead, we've done the opposite. We just, because we don't know whose we are as a society,
right?
We decide to just act on things, and then we see what we did, and we're like, I guess that's who I am.
Right.
Yeah. We've done the opposite, you know? And what has it caused? Chaos.
Right.
There's chaos everywhere, you know?
Yeah. It's really interesting. So just kind of in summary, the 4 steps: recognize, affirm, subvert, fulfill. So recognizing the identity narrative is that what our culture teaches is that we have to discover our deepest desires and fulfill them. Affirm is that, emotions aren't something we should ignore. Emotions are something we should examine and direct in the proper places.
And even to affirm, it is good that you're asking the question, who am I? Like,
sure,
we are made to know what our identity is. The fact that you're seeking is a good natural thing.
Yeah. And we are, like, identity is not simply being a part of a broad group.
Right.
There is an individualism that is appropriate. You are created as an individual by God. You will stand before God as an individual, not with your family, not with your ethnicity, on your own, But the subversion is that assumes we know our deepest desires, and that assumes our deepest desires are not in conflict with one another, which is never true. That also assumes that our desires aren't being influenced by the cultural narrative and grid that we see everything through. So we're really not being individuals. We're really just listening to our culture, what our culture says we should be.
And it's funny because do you know one of the things in which how do cults identify who they go after? It's the people who are the most lost of no one told them who they are.
Interesting.
Right? But also, on the flip side, there was a growing trend of NBA players, for example, that joined the Black Hebrew Israelite movement.
Okay.
Why? Because many of these basketball players didn't grow up with a father. No one told them who they were, and they're looking for someone because as there's a lot of things that group gets wrong, but one thing I think they get right is they have strong people telling others who they should be.
Sure. Yeah.
It's funny, as a society, even with the LGBT movement, why have so many people gone that way? You look at the statistics of Gen Z, for example.
Oh, right.
Because people are asking, who am I? And they are strongly saying, this is who you are.
Yep.
You know what I mean?
Yep.
And I say that to say we are all, as much as we say we are trying to be individuals or finding our true self, we're actually looking for someone to tell us who we are.
Absolutely.
And that goes, once again, the who we are to whose we are.
Yep.
It's except for as people, we look to other people instead of to God.
Yep.
That's.
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And then the fulfill, is that only in Christianity are we given an identity that we receive, not achieve, both in being made in the Imago Dei and in the redemption offered in Christ. Just kind of in closing, a couple maybe movies to think about this. So Frozen is definitely one. I think we mentioned Frozen last week too, but it is interesting that I think we mentioned this. Frozen subverts its own narrative. So the first part is about discover the true me.
Yeah.
And then she's just alone in an ice castle with a weird snowman, and doesn't work, And so it actually moves to self-sacrifice at the end. I think another one that I was just thinking of is Lion King. Simba kind of gets framed for his dad's death because his uncle, and he runs into the jungle and basically takes on the burden of discovering his new self. And so he I'm no longer a lion, I'm a vegetarian, I eat bugs with Timon and Pumbaa, and he recreates an identity that fits outside of where he was. And then the baboon Rafiki comes to him, and he has this vision of his father in the clouds, where he says, you have forgotten who you are. Remember who you are.
Yeah. And
that remembering who he is reminds him, I'm a son of the king, not because of something I did or didn't do. That's just something I've received, not achieved. And that turns him back to a life of purpose, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
Any others that come to mind?
I haven't fleshed this out, but I'll go ahead and say it and see what happens. But
I just made up the Lion King thing on the spot. That was not prepared. So,
Encanto's kind of like that.
Sure.
Too.
Yeah.
Right. Where every character, it's like you're the strong one, you're like the pretty one,
sure,
you're the whatever. But what happens when you try to live up to those expectations?
The house crumbles.
You start to break down. But I feel like some of the movie's themes are like breaking free of those chains,
right?
And in a sense, finding who you truly are outside of that. It's both like from one identity to another.
It is like with Encanto. It's like, no, don't worry about the burden of comparison. But you do have to worry about the burden of discovering who you are, right, which is much worse than comparison,
right.
Yeah.
But I think only in the gospel that you can use your true gifts to serve a greater purpose.
Yeah.
And I think Encanto kind of does land on that. It does follow a gospel narrative. I don't think it knows that.
Sure.
A gospel narrative that really those gifts are used to serve a greater purpose, in what we would say is in the gospel is, of course, God and his kingdom.
Sure.
And for the movie, it's the family. But I feel like that has an identity narrative too.
Yeah, I'd agree with you. That's good. Yeah, I'd say because this one is so prevalent, almost all of the stuff you see now is going to have some version of this.
Yes.
Some version of like chase your dreams, discover you.
Yeah.
So it's something to be aware of. And sometimes, you know, if you're a parent with young kids, I definitely think like most of this stuff is like lost on kids, that they're like most kids watching content, they'll be like, oh, like we're all special,
Right.
you know, and like, yes, that's great.
Right.
But sometimes I'm the obnoxious dad that I'll pause the movie and I'll look at my oldest and be like, do you know what this movie's trying to teach you right now?
That's not obnoxious. I think that's being a good parent.
Well, and that's what I was going to say too. I'd encourage the parents.
It's obnoxious if you're having a sleepover and you're like 9 and then there's like 12 of your daughter's friends.
Right.
That's a little obnoxious, I guess. But not if you're just home at home with your family. Yeah.
So, you know, I'd encourage you as parents to be on the lookout for this narrative, and don't be obnoxious about it, but help your kids identify it.
Yeah.
And help your kids see that, like, you know, there's a good way to follow your dreams and there's a really bad way to follow your dreams. And it all depends on how you're analyzing your dreams,
right,
and what standard you're evaluating them through.
Yeah.
It's like the end of Ecclesiastes when Solomon says something like, chase after your heart, but know that God will bring you into judgment for all that you do.
Yep.
And it's like, if you can hold those two things in tandem, chase after your dreams, but do it through a biblical lens, and know that God will judge you for how you live your life. And so chase the dreams that honor God.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think last final thought here, that as we're going through this, is all of these narratives come from a place of our society has advanced enough that we are just bored with our comfort.
Right. Right.
You know what I mean? Like,
Must be so nice.
You know, like 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, it's like, you know who I am?
I'm trying to survive.
The guy who doesn't want to die. You know, it's like, that's who I am. You know, no one's asking who's my true self.
100%.
My true self is, do I eat today?
Yes.
Right? And I think it's just something to be aware of, that as we advance in our society to AI and more comfort and less that we have to do in some ways, I know we, as Americans, we fill our time with just crazy schedules all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But these questions only come up when our base purposes have been fulfilled by other things.
Sure.
Right? Like, I don't have to grow my own food or kill my own meat or whatever it is. And so it's important for us to recognize that with the good of advancing technology, where you have modern medicine that will cure maybe cancer one day, and or whatever it is, these are actually the real problems in society we need to be aware of and teach our kids in.
Yep.
Yeah. So the first people you need to catechize / counter-catechize is your children.
Yep.
And be aware they're going to grow up in even more comfort and even more confusion than we did as parents.
Mm-hmm.
And their children even more, and their children even more. And so...
And then we'll get raptured.
Yes.
Listen to if you want to really get confused, listen to our End Times series podcast. There you go. Well, thanks for joining us for Monday Musings this week. We'll be back next week with more Counter-Catechesis.